Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where we bring research into real-world conversations. I'm Dr. Dion Stevens, your host and co-author of the Psychology of Black Womanhood book. I'm so excited to have you with us. So let's get into today's episode. We're exploring the intersection of race and sex trafficking. Studies have noted that race affects a woman's risk for sex trafficking vulnerability and exploitation. Relatedly, it also shapes the structure of trafficking networks and the personal experience of the traffickers, victims, and the male consumers. Overall, the research points to the need for deeper understanding and action to address these systemic issues and their unique impact on Black women's experiences. Dr. Jacqueline C.A. Michelle Maya joins us in this episode to break down how racialized histories of violence continue to shape the experience of sex-trafficked Black women today. Dr. Michelle Maya is a licensed social worker in the state of Ohio. She's also an associate professor in the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University, who's authored numerous works on social work practice and education, human trafficking, human rights, social justice, and leadership at the university, local, national, and international levels. As I know, historically and even in popular culture, we see all these images of Black women and women of color being sex trafficked. But a lot of the imagination when we're thinking about victims is about white women. So there's this dual kind of imagery and message that we're hearing about this culture. And then even in the research, the way in which we talk about Black women and women of color as being sex trafficked is still slightly different. I guess where I want to start is, why are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, women of color disproportionately represented in sex trafficking statistics?
Yes, I think it is based on historical precedents. It's about these controlling images of Black women, Indigenous women, and women who are Asian and Pacific Islanders. Either we are stereotyped with this trope of being Jezebel, having an insatiable appetite for sex, with no regards for who we select as partners. And that's one of the major controlling stereotypes around Black women. When it comes to Indigenous and Pacific Islanders, this whole thing about being exotic, this desire to have exotic women, it is these fetishes and this Jezebel trope that continues to control the images of racialized women, therefore making them more vulnerable to being sex trafficked.
And is there a reason, though, that we're seeing statistical differences? Because if there's more white women, why are we seeing more women of color in the statistics?
Absolutely. It's about the hyper invisibility and lack of care and concern around Black women in particular. Oftentimes, Black women are not considered to be victims, even when they are victims. And let me just speak to a moment about the vulnerability, even as Black girls, because we know trafficking tends to start at ages 12 to 14. And so when you think about adultification bias, there's a group of legal scholars out of Georgetown who talks quite a bit about adultification bias. It is this adultification bias that makes, for example, Black girls vulnerable. If you engage in adultification bias, you treat Black girls like little Black women. We know that Black girls are not women. If we hold them to the standards of being women, we're going to less likely believe them when they say they are being victimized. We're going to hold them to a higher standard in their conduct, and we're going to treat them more harshly as Black girls. It is that vulnerability that makes them subject to being targeted in a variety of systems. And once they're entangled in these systems, they are at increased vulnerability for being trafficked and targeted by perpetrators.
So it sounds like there's multiple levels of influence that are really shaping what's going on. So how is systemic racism playing into this?
Systemic racism plays into everything. When you think about white supremacy, infrastructure, systemic policies, procedures, practices in place, unfortunately, it has also infiltrated the anti-trafficking arena, even the legislation. When you think about the original legislation around trafficking in this country in 2000 with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, when that initial legislation came out about defining human trafficking regarding commercial sex, it talked about the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, and soliciting individuals for the purpose of sex. They talked about the force, fraud, and coercion in terms of elements needed to prove that you are being trafficked as an adult. What it left out was targeting Black women, Black girls. It focused on international scholars. There was this prevailing myth that trafficked individuals were immigrants. And they totally disregarded women right here in this country, disproportionately Black women who continue to be hyper victimized but hyper invisible simultaneously. So although the numbers are small as a group, disproportionately we continue to be targeted because we're not important. We're throwaways as individuals. Black women continue to be silenced and over victimized in a number of arenas, including sex trafficking arena.
At the individual level, what's making Black women and Black girls, as you point out, vulnerable to being brought into sex trafficking or being victimized by sex trafficking?
A number of factors contribute to that. Black girls being disproportionately suspended and removed from the installation and support of school systems. Black girls being involved in a child welfare system where they AWOL and therefore are out there vulnerability with no supervision and care and guidance of guardians or parents. And drug use. Drug use is unfortunately highly correlated with being trafficked, being exposed to adverse childhood experiences around abuse, neglect to household functioning, being members of the LGBT community. So all of these variables are entangled. And when you layer them, it makes particularly Black girls extremely vulnerable to being targeted and trafficked.
You also talk about in your work the importance of space and region. How do geographical factors then contribute to the racial dynamics of sex trafficking?
Sure. Well, the research shows that sex trafficking is present in all the 50 states. And we know this because we know we are arresting, for example, Black girls for prostitution charges. And by the way, according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, there is no such thing as child prostitution. If you are less than 18 years of age, you are considered to be a sex trafficking victim if you are engaged in commercialized sex. The problem is when these young girls come into contact with law enforcement, social workers, first responders, they are not considered to be victims. They're considered to be complicit in those illegal actions and therefore making them more vulnerable. So as I was saying about the 50 states, we know that it occurs in all 50 states, but several studies, including one of the ones we're talking about today, when you think about where are the victims found, first of all, they're in the rural counties, they are in the urban areas. But when I think about one of my studies, in particular, the one around race, on the East Side, in fact, this is commonplace in many studies. Black women, women of color, tend to be found on the east side in the Strohs. We have the white women primarily on the west sides of the Strohs. So even in my study, the women talked about Main Street versus the Hilltop area. And so geographic location has played a role in who's targeted and who is advertised where in terms of trafficking.
What are the implications of having these separate spaces and what kind of dynamics are occurring in these separate kind of spaces where white women who are victims are on one side and Black women victims or women of color are kept on the other?
And there are implications. So thank you for saying that. So when you think about these safe havens, these drop-in centers, the research shows, the news shows, the latest and greatest safe haven drop-in center is going to be where the white women primarily are found to be. Black women are not oftentimes having those same services or access to those services. And so what you'll find, those who are committed to doing something about trafficking, they're not going to realize or include Black women in these services, these activities, this attention, even the patrolling of areas. And we know in terms of accessibility, in order to use services like drop-in centers and safe havens, women need to be able to physically get to them. And if they're not in their locations, in their neighborhoods, and their communities, they will not have access. So there are serious implications to this.
How can anti-trafficking efforts then become more inclusive and actually be tailored to address the unique needs of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and women of color?
I love that question. Several things could be done. First of all, let's fund some Black researchers, some Indigenous researchers, because the truth is the funding streams are allocated predominantly to white-headed, white-led organizations. We know that a number of survivors are activists and advocates, and they'll, out of the kindness and care of their hearts, they'll open up their spaces, homes given or gifted to them by churches, to find and provide services for these individuals. However, they're not greatly funded, their doors close pretty rapidly, or they have very little support to sustain their efforts. And so we really want to make this more inclusive, fund researchers to do the research, to support the findings around what's really out there, who's being victimized, and in alignment with those findings, offer services so that individuals who are Black and white BIPOC in general can access those services. When it comes to funding, allocating monies, let's fund survivor-led agencies by Black women in particular. Rarely done. In fact, they're not even competitive for most grant RFPs because they don't meet that $1 million threshold budget, for example. There's so many barriers to women who want to do this good work, who are survivors, but are not given the opportunity to do so. So I say, one, let's fund researchers. Two, let's fund survivors as lead. And let's open up this whole narrative about who are the real victims. If we continue to have this rhetoric about everyone is a victim, we are never going to get to the heart of who really has been victimized. When we espouse these views about everyone is a victim, it takes away resources, time, grant, efforts to people who are truly vulnerable for being sex trafficked, especially Black and Indigenous women and girls in this country.
Within the Black community, there doesn't seem to be a lot of open discussion about this human trafficking. What do you think is going on there, and what can we do to address that?
A lot of people simply do not understand what human trafficking is. And a part of the problem is even victims who are being trafficked oftentimes do not understand they too are victims until well after they are in treatment. They start to hear from some peers and some counselors and social workers who describe to them what they've been through is human trafficking. So first of all, they don't understand it. And in terms of the Black community, we are very supportive of one another, and at times we're not aware that some of us are being victimized, especially when you pair trafficking with drug use. So oftentimes that drug use overshadows victimization. And so we may see our sisters out there in the street and chalk it up to, oh, someone doing drugs, and that's all that it is. Well, oftentimes it can't be drugs. Sometimes the drugs come before the trafficking. Sometimes the drugs are introduced during the trafficking. So because they are paired, they're sometimes conflated and misunderstood. So we too, as a Black community, unfortunately, are not always up on what trafficking actually is. And we sometimes confuse it with voluntary sex work or just prostitution.
How is that different between prostitution and sex trafficking?
Thank you for saying that, because sometimes prostitution and sex work is a part of sex trafficking, but not all of that is sex trafficking. Sex trafficking has a very specific definition based on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And first of all, as I mentioned to you, those routes of the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or solicitation. But those elements around force, fraud, and coercion as criminal elements in terms of these activities differ from prostitution. Prostitution in itself is considered a criminal offense. But when someone is sex trafficked and engaged in forced prostitution, then the perpetrator becomes the criminal and not the victim. Whereas in prostitution, the woman who, in this case, who's out on the street is considered a criminal. So the status of the offender changes between sex trafficking and prostitution.
I know we talk about the media broadly, but I'm thinking about the Black media specifically. What's your opinion about the way Black medias frame sex trafficking and women in these positions?
Mm-hmm. Black media is a friend and foe when it comes to the objectification of Black women and girls. This whole glorification of being sexually available, half-dressed, portrayed as perpetrators and complicit, even when they're victims, is highly problematic and contribute to those prevalent controlling images of Black women and girls being Jezebel, loose, available, and incapable of being raped or sexually victimized. And so it would be to our advantage and benefit if we start to control the images of Black women and stop the objectification I'm all about recognizing the beauty of the Black body. That is very different than objectification, and we need to distinguish between the two in Black media.
Relatedly, in the media, we also then celebrate the men as being powerful when they're the traffickers. And what I liked about your work is that you actually explored specifically Black men as traffickers. Now, of course, white men and men of other groups do. But in your study, you did look at Black male traffickers. How does this finding align or challenge common perceptions?
Thank you for asking that question. Unlike people who are trafficked, I think the parameters around the profile characteristics of traffickers are more broad. Traffickers can be family members, partners, boyfriends, formerly trafficked individuals, drug dealers, entrepreneurs, they call themselves. A lot of different people can be traffickers. So I wanted to say that from the jump. But the data varies about who they actually are. Overwhelmingly, traffickers are men in this country and abroad, without a doubt. And there is some research around disproportionately white men being charged at a much higher level on a national scale with human trafficking charges. And there are a number of studies, including mine, where the women identify overwhelmingly their dope boy drug dealer doubled up as a human trafficker. And so, yes, Black men, some of them as drug dealers, do indeed traffic Black and white women, absolutely. So do white men sell women, Black, white, and otherwise. And so in terms of this whole notion of what type of men traffic women, what crosses between the Black trafficker and the white trafficker is that they're criminals engaging in criminal activities in a very violent manner. And overwhelmingly, as I said in this study, the Black women talked about Black traffickers and dope boys. The white women talked about Black male traffickers doubling up as dope boys. And what they agreed was the great equalizer in traffickers was that this thing about drug use, drug dependency among the women who are in the streets.
So it really ties back to, like you said, substance use. Who's distributing the substance is really linked to all of this too.
Absolutely.
What was another important or major finding that might surprise people from your work?
A lot of people are often surprised when I tell them that many trafficked people do not know they're being trafficked. And I know that may sound very surprising. How can you be trafficked? And keep in mind, some women are trafficked 4 to 10 years. How are you subjected to this and not know it? And the best way to summarize how this is possible is that actually trafficking is bad, but not every single day is bad. And I put it this way, as a traffic woman once told me, Jacqueline, there's some joy out there being in the streets. Get the drugs that you want. You don't have to care about anybody but yourself. You can make money off your body. You don't have to work 9 to 5. Sometimes he's good to me. Sometimes he's not. Some of us get promoted. We go higher up in the ranks, and we don't have to be out on the streets anymore. So there is some joy, as some puts it, in terms of being out there in the streets. One thing that I found to be so surprising was people's hesitancy and reluctance to talk about race. Even if it was clear to the women and their experiences as trafficked individuals, although they may initially start out saying, I don't see race, I didn't think about it. But at the same time, he was a Black man, and I think he got his kicks off of trafficking white women, naive women, women on drugs. And so what I found more surprising was the reluctancy to identify the trafficker if he was a Black male, and just not wanting to talk about race, even though it was glaring that this was something they were aware of as trafficked women, whether they were Black or white.
What do you think is the most urgent issue that needs to be addressed when it comes to the sex trafficking of Black women?
We need to realize and articulate every time that we can, everywhere that we can, that Black women and Black girls are victims too. They have truly been left out the narrative about trafficked persons, victimization, women as human beings. Until we change the controlling images around Black women and Black girls, they are never going to be given the benefit of the doubt when they are victimized, especially around sex crimes. I think that Black women and Black girls, including Indigenous women, are probably the only people in this country who are victimized in terms of sex crimes and are held accountable and blamed for their victimization.
You teach a class on human trafficking. Can you tell us about that and who comes to the class, what you teach, and what's the response to that?
So I created a human trafficking class. It must have been about 10 years ago. So I created the course about 10 years ago. At the time, it was in person. Basically, I travel the world trying to understand human trafficking. I have examples of labor and sex trafficking in different parts of the world. And I said to myself one day, it is time to create a course because people need to understand this is an international issue, a domestic issue, and a local issue. And what I've found is that some of the students are from social work, but it's a general education course. So most of my students are not in social work. They tend to be people who truly want to make a difference. They want to learn about what trafficking looks like. But what I've also discovered over the years that many college students worry that they're vulnerable to being trafficked. And they are not one of the vulnerable populations. So I do think that many of them enroll in the class so they can be sure that they can help themselves and prevent themselves from being trafficked. But I do get a variety of majors. It's a joint master's and undergrad course. And so students across the spectrum tend to enroll in the class. The class is now offered online only, and it's extremely popular. We offer 4 to 6 sections every single semester out of the 3 semesters in a year. It's a highly sought out course for undergrad and graduate students here at the university.
Have you thought about doing something in the community in terms of education or workshops, or do you do that already?
Oh, I have done quite a bit around education. For example, in 2013, I created a course, the Massive Open Online course, a MOOC course. There were 30,000 people from 187 nations enrolled in that course because people are genuinely interested in learning about human trafficking. I created an iTunes course about human trafficking that was well received, 14 modules that was open and viewed by a number of people around the world as well. And now I have a press book, a book created that's online, accessible, that I used in the course because I wanted to offset the cost of books. I did not want textbooks being something that prevented students from enrolling in the class and learning about human trafficking. And quite frankly, it changes so often, it makes sense that you will continue to have a online open access book that you can update, which we are now in the middle of updating for a 2025 edition of that open access textbook.
What's next for you? You do all this research and you have so many articles, you do policy, you teach.
Moving forward, I am committed to all of my research, including women with lived experiences as co-creators of knowledge. It is really important to me moving forward. My last 2 projects, including one that I'm working on right now, is working with survivors as lived experience to engage in every step of my research, having them to help me develop my research questions, my IRB protocol, collecting data, helping me to define my sample, what individuals I am going to use in my studies, helping me to analyze the data and come up with recommendations. I've decided that I've learned all that I know because of the kindness and vulnerability of women who have allowed themselves to engage in storytelling with me. And I've learned things about trafficking not because I necessarily asked, they shared with me. And so I found that my entire career, up until recently, I've been missing really important opportunities to really get ahead of this sex trafficking victimization because I was not co-partnering on the front end with survivors. So moving forward, I plan to front and center the whole notion that race is a mitigating factor and who is most vulnerable to being trafficked. And I will commit to that as a community engaged research scholar and a scholar activist.
That was Dr. Michelle Maya discussing her research examining the systemic influence of race and gender on sex trafficking outcomes. For more details about her work, accessing her research articles, and where to follow her online, check out the episode page on the Psychology of Black Womanhood website. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where research meets the real world. We've got some incredible guests lined up for upcoming shows, so be sure to check out our episode topics. If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to support the podcast, we'd love it if you share it with your friends and family. And don't forget to grab a copy of the book that goes hand in hand with this podcast, The Psychology of Black Womanhood. Thanks again for being part of this journey. Until next time, let's keep growing, connecting, and centering Black women's lived experiences and the research that brings it all to life.